Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Ramaz evening, what we are terming the Notorious RBG, Setting the Record Straight, an evening to remember and think about Justice Ginsburg and all that she contributed in her lifetime to not just the bench, but to the world in which we live. It is wonderful to have so many of you joining us tonight. And as you realize, since we've had so many of you on before with us, we always like to start these evenings by wishing first and foremost a refuah shlema to everyone and anyone that in any way is touched by or has been ill with corona or any other illness at this time. We pray for a refuah shlema, and we are with you. And for those of you who have lost loved ones, and we just had another family in our community, the Abrahams family who just lost a mother to corona, we are with you and your families. And as a community, we stand together very strongly at this time. And we are praying together for you and for your comfort. So tonight is also, coincidentally, the yahrzeit of a very special woman of valor in our lives, and that is Golda Meir. Tonight happens to be her yahrzeit, and how appropriate it is. And I did want to just recognize that it is the yahrzeit of Golda Meir, and a moment to think about another woman of valor. And in that respect, I say that tonight's evening is sponsored by Deborah North in honor and in memory of the mothers and grandmothers who instill in their daughters and granddaughters the courage and the resilience and elegance to succeed, and passed on the ethic of responsibility to make a contribution to society. And she quoted the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks when she said this. He describes it as Judaism's great contribution to the world, the way in which mothers pass these along. So thank you to Deborah North for sponsoring this evening. We are very privileged to have as our moderator, Jennifer Bernstein. Jennifer Bernstein, who is known to some of you, but those who haven't yet met her, it is a privilege to both know her and then to hear her speak. Jennifer Bernstein is the head of our middle school at Ramaz. She taught American history both at Ramaz and before in public schools for 19 years. And she is now part of the Ramaz leadership team, where she was the head, as I said, of the middle school. Prior to teaching, she served as an officer of Columbia University in the Urban Policy Center and as a case manager in litigation at the law firm Karath, Swain, and Moore. She graduated from Barnard College and has her master's from Columbia University. She is best known in some Ramaz circles as the mother of David in our 11th grade, Benjamin in 3rd grade, and Yakira, our star freshman. She will be speaking with the one and only David Schizer. David is well known in the Ramaz community, as you'll hear, for his daughters, but also known as because he clerked for Justice Ginsburg from 1994 to 1995, her second year in the US Supreme Court. He is the Dean Emeritus and Harvey R. Miller Professor of Law and Economics at Columbia Law School, and he served as the dean from 2004 to 2014. At the age of 35, Schizer was the youngest dean in the history of the law school, and he served for the longest time. While on a 3-year leave from the law school from 2017 to 2019, he served as part of the Jewish leadership as the executive vice president and CEO of the American Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, where he did amazing, amazing work. But as I said, he is really best known to us as the father of our graduate, Josephine, who is in Israel this year, and we wish her very, very well, and to Eve, our 11th grader, and to Judah, who is in 7th grade. It is so wonderful that you have graced us this evening, David, with being able to be with us and to come forward with all of the understanding and the knowledge of Justice Ginsburg. And we very much look forward to the dialogue this evening. In advance, so everyone knows, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. Please use the Q&A to ask any questions you have. We will certainly get to as many of those questions as possible. And for those questions that we are unable to answer, I know already, because I asked permission, that David and/or Jennifer will be happy to answer them offline. In advance, I thank everyone for being with us and wish you a happy Thanksgiving. Take it away, Jennifer.
Thank you, Kenny. Let me begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be here this evening. I've been looking forward to this evening since Kenny first asked us. And thank you, David, for joining us and being willing to share your experiences with Justice Ginsburg. Let's start with some basics. Tell us a little bit about the work of justices on the court and specifically how clerks help them with their work.
So Jennifer, it's a pleasure to be here and such a treat to get to have this conversation with you. And yeah, let's start with that. So I would say justices really do 5 things, and clerks play a different role as to each. So the first thing that the court has to do is to pick which cases it's going to decide. And thousands of cases are submitted by the parties with the request that the court hear them, and they only hear about 80. So the clerks actually play a pretty significant role in screening. There are criteria the justices specify, and the clerks then sort of highlight the ones that are most likely to meet those criteria. So that's one. The second thing they do, of course, is hear oral argument, and the clerks are supposed to help them prepare, reading the briefs, reading the cases, offering thoughts in advance. The third thing the justices do is that one of them is going to write an opinion. And if it is your justice who's writing the opinion, you might be the clerk who is helping her or him to do that. The fourth thing they do is react to the drafts that others have circulated, and that might mean, yes, we agree with this, we'll join it, and it might also mean, no, we disagree and we'll write a dissent. The clerks are advisors in that as well. And then finally, I just sort of offer a category we call other. They give speeches, they go places, they might want a little help drafting the speech, doing a bit of research, and so the clerks do that too.
Thank you. And what was life like in the chambers with her? Could you discuss the division of labor between Justice Ginsburg and her clerks?
So there's kind of a cliche about that division of labor between justices and clerks. And I would say that RBG was not really consistent with that cliche. And the cliche is you have a very wise senior person sort of giving big picture guidance. And then there are these 4 clever young people who work really hard to implement that, and they draft and they come up with creative arguments and all the rest. And the thing about Justice Ginsburg is she was emphatically playing both roles. She had the kind of seasoning and experience where she really did bring a kind of a remarkable perspective about a case, about its implications, about what you want to say, what you wouldn't want to say. But at the same time, she really didn't need the help of clerks either to do the research or to come up with the right arguments. She was incredibly gifted at that as well. And so the 2 things that I will highlight are, one, the work ethic. I can't imagine how she was able to sustain the level of effort that she put in, because she first became a judge back in 1980 on the DC Circuit, and she was working at this pace. And then, of course, in her years on the Supreme Court. And so the thing about RBG, she was very much a night owl. She was not a morning person. She hated the morning. The only time she would get up and get to court at, say, 9 o'clock is when there were oral arguments, which was 1 week every month. But other than that, her day would begin at more like noon, and her workday would end at something like 4 or 5 in the morning. And so she was working through the night. That was her most productive time. So the work ethic is one. And the second is just the really rare intellectual gifts. And to give a sense of that, this happened a few times. She'd call me in and she'd say, David, I want you to check this quote for me. I did it from memory. And I also gave you the cite from memory. I think it's on this page on the right-hand column. And I have to say, each time she gave me this quote from memory, not only the quote was perfectly correct, but also the citation. So not a lot of people can do that.
Indeed, wow. We know of Justice Ginsburg as the notorious RGB. She became truly a pop culture icon, complete with action figures, which you don't see every day from Supreme Court justices. Did you expect that when you worked with her 25 years ago?
So I would go pretty far out and say, not only did I not expect it, but I would have bet my entire life savings that it would never happen. There is no, but I'll be I'll take a harder line. I said to the justice not that long ago, I said, Justice, of all the people in the world that I knew 25 years ago, and even of people I knew about, if you asked me who was least likely to become a pop culture icon, I would have said you. And she laughed, and I think she said, I know, me too. And the thing about RBG is, first of all, she was all about the ideas. She was all about the results. She had no interest in sort of personal acclaim or publicity. I should say, I think she appreciated it when she became as prominent as she became, but that was never a motivation. And the second thing is, she knew nothing about popular culture. And I really don't think nothing is any kind of overstatement. Her knowledge of popular culture ended probably with Wagner. She didn't go to the movies very often. When she would go, she would bring a flashlight with her and she would go through her mail. So Saturday Night Live, I'm quite sure she'd never heard of it before they started parodying her.
Incredible. On a more serious note, she showed an iron will. You know, we've all read about it in battling illness for so many years. Can you talk a little bit about her determination when she faced difficult challenges such as her illnesses and others through her life?
So she is someone who was sort of steeled in fire in a way. And I think about her as a young girl. She was graduating from high school, and the day before she graduated, her mother passed away. And she was so close to her mother and revered her for the rest of her days. But I have to think that losing a parent at that age was a first blow, and she learned to recover from that. And then she was very happily married to her husband, Marty. They had a young child. And then out of nowhere, Marty developed testicular cancer. And it was serious. And fortunately, he recovered and lived a wonderful life. But if you think about two really serious blows as a young person, she started to sort of learn to be resilient, and she was very resilient. But I will say, Jennifer, I can only think of one time when the justice was really angry with me. I mean, really angry with me. And it was the first bout of cancer. And I would say in retrospect, presumptuously, urged her to slow down her pace. And I said, because really, you're in this for the long haul. You've got to take care of yourself. And I'm sure your colleagues would be happy to reduce the number of opinions that you're writing this term. She got pretty angry and she basically said, David, this is the way I cope. And she's right. But basically, her approach was just to put her head down and move forward. And she did it again and again.
Before she was a judge, Justice Ginsburg was a successful advocate for women's rights. What motivated her, do you think, to take on those issues in particular?
So it's worth highlighting this because really it's a rare thing. She obviously left an important impact as a judge. But even before she ever became a judge, she really did transform American law in her advocacy on behalf of women. And I've asked her over time how she dreamed up to do that and what her motivations were. And I think really a lot of it had to do with her own personal experiences. She had the top grades in her class when she graduated from Columbia Law School. Ordinarily, that would mean that any door she wanted to open was open to her. And instead, in her case, she could not get a job. She just couldn't get a job. And I thought to ask her, I don't know, about 10, 11 years ago, hey, where did you spend your summer as a summer associate? Because it's true now, it was even true then. After your second year in law school, you usually work at a law firm and they almost always invite you back. And so she told me, and I said, and what happened there? Well, I had a really good experience, she said. I was sure they were going to invite me back, and they didn't. And in the conversation where they told me that they weren't going to, they said, well, Ruth, the thing is, we already hired a woman. So you have to think about what it felt like to be a person with her energy, talent, and work ethic, to be told that one woman was enough. I should conclude, though, by mentioning what Marty, her late husband, said, because he was in that conversation too. He said, "Ruth, you know, you owe them." And she said, "How?" And he said, "Because if not for them, you'd be a partner at a law firm now." And she laughed and said, "I suppose that's true."
Exactly. As an advocate, she faced a very difficult challenge. She was trying to introduce a new idea in constitutional jurisprudence that the Equal Protection Clause required equal treatment of men and women. The judges deciding this issue were all men at the time, of course. How did she go about it? What was her strategy as an advocate, and did it work?
She was very farsighted and very disciplined. And I remember her saying to me once, not exactly about this, but about something similar, that the goal is to succeed, not to feel good about it. And so what she was looking for were the cases that would have the best chance of persuading an all-male judiciary. So that was one. Two, she thought ahead, kind of like a good chess player. She actually argued 8 cases, as I recall. She won 7 of 8, which is pretty remarkable, especially for a proposition that had no real precedent before she started. But she figured out, if I win one like this, then I need to try this and this. And so each built on the last. But one of the most important insights that she had was that if the goal is to establish that the Constitution mandated gender equality, that men and women had to be treated equally before the law, equal protection of the law, she realized that one way to make the point was with situations where the men were disadvantaged. And she figured if she did that, then these all-male courts might get it in a way that they wouldn't quite see it when the plaintiff was a female. So just to give one example, her client in one case was named Stephen Weisenfeld. And the Social Security system at the time said that if a man had worked and passed away, then there would be survivor benefits for his widow. And what happened to Stephen, tragically, is that it was his wife who passed away. He survived. They had a baby, a young child, and he wanted to take a couple of years off to focus on their son. And so he was hoping and expecting to get these survivorship benefits. And then he learned, well, no, it turns out not for you, because we give those to widows, but not to widowers. So RBG brought that one all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the court agreed with her. And actually, as a coda to that story, the little baby, Jason Weisenfeld, ended up going to Columbia Law School. I had a meeting with Jason when I was dean, and then I called the justice and I said, you know, I just met Jason Weisenfeld, and you know that he graduated from Columbia Law School? And she said, of course I know that he graduated from Columbia Law School. It's been a few weeks since I've been in touch with him, but he and I are in touch, which I think tells you something else about RBG, just about her heart and about the people that matter to her.
Much has been written about the friendship between her and Justice Antonin Scalia, one of the court's leading conservatives, that they've used to go to opera together and other things. Some people wonder about that since their views were so different. Can you talk a little bit about that? Yeah,
so the first thing is it was absolutely a real and close friendship. It was mutual. They really did admire and respect each other. And in fact, the two of them and their spouses had, I think, New Year's Eve dinner pretty much every year. That was one of the things they did. And they were first colleagues on the DC circuit. Then Justice Scalia went up to the Supreme Court. RBG followed him not that long thereafter. But I think there's an assumption people make, which is not true, which is that it was a friendship grounded on their mutual appreciation of opera and travel, and all that's true, but it really wasn't it. What is true is that if she were here, I think she'd probably emphasize how much they actually did have in common. And so these were two people, both from New York, both from backgrounds where they had to work pretty hard to get ahead, and they both did. They both had a deep appreciation for the craft of judging, getting the language right, writing and rewriting. They both believed in meritocracy, each of them in their own way, very committed to that. So needless to say, as to jurisprudential philosophy, pretty different on some issues. But to them, that was just a part of it. And there was enough that they had in common that they were indeed very, very close. And RBG certainly felt strongly that the fact that you disagreed with someone, even pretty passionately on some issues, did not mean that it was personal. And in fact, you might win them over another time. And so that was pretty much her approach, was to do her best always to keep it on the merits, to be collegial, and to win any votes that she could get.
It's heartening to hear about such deep trust and mutual respect, given their disparate viewpoints. You've spoken a little bit about this evening, Marty, RBG's spouse. He was a well-known tax lawyer. You too are a tax lawyer. Is there any connection there? Did he have anything to do with that?
He had a lot to do with it. So my last week working for RBG, I went into her office, thanked her for the opportunity, and I said, Justice, I'd really appreciate your advice. What do you think I should do next? And so this is sort of a quintessential RBG answer. She looked at me and she said, you should do what you want to do. And that is wise and not at all helpful. So I think what was going on in her mind was she knew, and she wasn't wrong, that if she made a clear suggestion, I might take it almost too seriously. And she didn't want to do that. She wanted me to figure it out for myself. But that's not why I was there. So I said, well, Justice, what do you think I should want to do? And so she laughed and she said, okay, well, tell me what you like. And the question there really meant lawyers do lots of different types of things, and what are the things that you find appealing? And I said, well, before I clerked, I knew I was interested in business, and I thought that I wanted to be an M&A lawyer. But the experience clerking has shown me how much I really enjoy the nuances of statutory interpretation. So she paused and she looked at me and she said, have you talked to Marty about tax? So I did, and I tried it, and all these years later, I still love it.
Incredible. We have a question in the chat, and I've been wondering myself, what role did her Jewish identity play both in her career and in her life more generally?
So her answer to that question always was to quote and to observe that she had a sign in her chambers, which she did, saying, justice, justice, thou shalt pursue. And I know that she was passionate about that idea. And I know because she said on many occasions, both publicly and privately, that her Jewish identity was fundamental to who she was. And I can also say that she was bat mitzvahed at the East Midwood Jewish Center. It's where I was bar mitzvahed in Brooklyn some years later. But I do think it's fair to say that it wasn't just talk. And one example is I was there very early in her time at the court, her second year. And so I gathered that her first holiday party in December was called a Christmas party. And then when I got there, thanks to her suggestion, it became called the holiday party. But she, and what I understand about that is it's not that it particularly bothered her, it's that there were Jewish clerks who would have preferred it to be called a holiday party instead of a Christmas party, and she took it on herself to make that suggestion.
And now that's the norm. RBG graduated from Columbia Law School. You were dean of that law school for 10 years. How involved was she in the school, and what was that involvement like?
She was extremely involved, and she was involved partly because the school was always so incredibly honored and proud to have her as a graduate. But I will give an example of what Columbia meant to her. So she started at Harvard Law School, spent her first 2 years there. Marty, her husband, was a year ahead and he graduated. And then she was in a complicated position because he had just recovered from cancer. He was moving to New York to take a job. And they had a daughter at the time who is now my colleague, Jane, at Columbia Law School. And so it did not make sense for her to stay in Cambridge when Marty was moving to New York. And so she asked the administration, could I please finish my education at Columbia, but still get the Harvard degree, which is pretty standard thing. Truthfully, people do that all the time. And she was a bit surprised, but the answer came back, no. And when she asked why, she always liked to repeat the answer. The answer was, because it was your choice to have a child. So no degree from Harvard, that was fine with her. She transferred to Columbia, had the highest grade in her class, grades in her class at Columbia, just as she had at Harvard, is my understanding, and went about her career. And then when she was a judge on the DC Circuit, a few years into that, someone at Harvard figured out that she had gone to Harvard but not graduated. And so they called her up and they said, Judge Ginsburg, you went to Harvard, but you don't have a degree. And the way she described the story, she would say, actually, I know that. And so they said, well, Judge, would you like a Harvard degree? And she'd say, okay. And they said, the only thing is you have to give up your Columbia degree. So the way she tells the story, she was never quite clear what that could mean to give up her Columbia degree, but she had no interest in doing it. So her answer was no. And it was not for another 10 years or so, maybe a bit more. No, it was more actually. Elena Kagan was then the dean at Harvard Law School, tried this again, heard the issue, and figured out that it really ought to be an honorary degree. And so that's when she finally got a degree from Harvard, the honorary degree. But the point is, not that I'm telling that story, but that she told that story many times and always with pride.
And she had many honorary degrees. I remember when I graduated from Columbia University, she was granted an honorary degree, as well as those she had graduating law school, and other universities have as well. We have some questions in the chat, and I just want to remind everyone, if you haven't had a chance to post your question, please do. A couple of questions about what RBG loved and remembered most about growing up in Brooklyn. A couple of these from fellow Brooklynites. So we'd love to hear more about that.
So she had positive things to say about Madison High School. I do think she was, she felt herself to be very fortunate in the parents she had. And she would talk about the fact that even though her mother had to go off to work at a young age, couldn't get the kind of education that she should have had, that she was utterly committed that her daughter, I think they called her Kiki, certainly her childhood friends all called her Kiki, but that, you know, Ruth should have all the opportunities that her intellect deserved. And the justice would say on many occasions that when people would ask her, where did her confidence come from? It was the confidence that her mother gave her and herself. So I think close family, she would equate with her growing up in Brooklyn, and affection for her classmates at Madison High School, and lots of fond memories.
Thank you. RBG is also known for some of her more quotable quotes, if you will. Among them, she said she was a strong believer in listening and learning from others. Can you think of examples of this in her career in the time that you knew her?
So there are people who are successful and have figured out that the most fun they can have is just to talk and have other people listen. And RBG certainly had the kind of accomplishments that could have in some sense justified that approach to life. And she was so very much the opposite. She really was an amazingly attentive listener, and astonishingly so, in the sense that she would remember something years later that you happened to say. But I will give one example of getting to know the justice, where it always helped to have other people who already knew her giving you advice. And the point is, she had the greatest tolerance for conversational silence of anyone I've ever met. She would pause. She was listening really carefully to the question. She would pause and formulate her answer. And you really had to give it 3 or 4 seconds before you knew if she was done with what she was going to say. So listening is what she was doing, and thinking is what she was doing. And of course, the last thing I'll say is I credited her, I think appropriately, with pioneering a litigation strategy that changed the way the Equal Protection Clause is applied to women. And whenever anyone would say anything like that in her presence, she would start listing all the other people who were critically involved and that she was only one of many. And again, I think it was both generous on her part, but also true. And to her credit, she was always listening and borrowing any good idea that she could find.
If I haven't already said it, please, put your questions in the chat. David would like the focus this evening to be less political and more on reflections about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But there is a question, if you don't mind telling us, what was a favorite case that RBG worked on and spoke about?
So I think she was, fascinated by, engaged by, proud of any number of opinions that she got to write over the years. But I do think that one of them that was especially close to her heart was the decision about VMI, the military academy in Virginia, that had been all male. And the Supreme Court, with her writing the opinion, said that it had to be, that it had to start including women. And I think for her, there was, she was very aware of the trajectory within her own life, both the circumstances she encountered where it was thought that women couldn't do the things that she thought they could do, and of course her own advocacy. And the truth is, I don't think she did much of this, but anyone else writing that opinion probably would have cited the 7 cases that she won as an advocate, because VMI just built as a logical matter on all of those. So it said something to her about the country that there she was on the court to be the one to write the opinion.
In your article, you described yourself as a conservative clerk for a liberal justice. What role did those views play during your clerkship?
So it's true, I am now and was when she hired me, very much to the right of where she is, member of the Federalist Society at the time. I still am. She knew that when she hired me. And I think she found it appealing, actually, because she is fully capable, sort of thinking through an issue. But I think she did find it helpful to get lots of different perspectives on it. And my role was to raise questions, which perhaps in some cases were helpful. She seemed to think they were. She was the justice. She was going to make the decision. That was her call. But she was certainly and emphatically not someone who just wanted people to say they agreed. I mean, that wasn't what she expected. That wasn't helpful to her. She was really all about the idea, and she wanted the idea to be as clear and as well developed as she could make it, and any input she could get, including skeptical input, she found it helpful.
You clerked for her so early in her career on the bench. Do you see any ways in which she or her jurisprudence evolved over time?
So I think the biggest shift for her wasn't so much in ideas as it was in role, because the convention on the court is that the most senior judge in the majority, or in the dissent for that matter, would assign who writes. And so for many years, John Paul Stevens was there with her. They were very close. He was senior. And so there were quite a number of years on the court where he was understandably writing opinions where he was in the majority along with her. And when he retired, suddenly she found herself to be the senior justice in a group that often voted together. And so I think for her, there was new energy in the fact that she was the one either writing or assigning, whether it's an opinion or a dissent.
I like this question, but feel free to take a pass on it. Can you comment on RBG's famous workout?
It's impressive. I mean, I think she could do a plank for longer than I could. So she was doing it. Let me start by saying that when I was clerking for her back in 1994 to 95, she wasn't really doing that. It was sort of later when she had health issues, and she realized that it was important for her to pay more attention to that. But then it became a serious thing, and she would spend some time on it, and it's kind of impressive what she was able to do. I don't think she was ever at risk of being chosen for the Olympic team, but nevertheless, for someone in her 70s and then 80s, pretty impressive.
You mentioned opera and travel as hobbies and personal interests that she had. Were there any others that come to mind?
So Marty was a wonderful cook. She liked to eat what he would prepare. She would joke about being not a particularly talented chef, and I've heard confirmation from other family members that that was true. But obviously, she had an incredibly curious and engaging mind, and she read an awful lot. And that includes, she just loved the law, and so she would, there's a certain volume of cases that I imagine a justice would feel the need to read, and then you can maybe multiply that by 4, and that's what she was probably doing. So she did spend a great deal of time focusing on the law, and I would be remiss if I didn't say that the other love of her life was her family. And so she was deeply involved as a parent, as a grandmother, a doting grandmother, obviously an adoring spouse to her husband as he was to her. And really her commitment to family and her closeness to family was very, very inspiring.
Can you talk a little bit about her dissents and their impact?
So I know, yeah, her answer to that, she had a kind of an answer she would always give when asked about it, which is, well, I guess we'll have to see, but I won't be around to see it. And so really dissents sometimes influence attitudes over the years. That's the way she thought about them. She did have a pet peeve though. And the pet peeve was that the media would focus on these 5-4 coalitions, and sometimes she was in the majority and maybe more often she wasn't. But her point was that there were usually twice as many unanimous opinions as 5-4 opinions in a given year, and that the work of the court was such that a lot of it didn't divide based on which president or which party appointed a justice. It was just sort of straight up judging, and people were likely to come to the same opinion. And she felt very strongly that she wanted the country to know that these 5-4 opinions, they were the exception. And when she was in dissent, that was not the way she particularly wanted to be remembered. It was, you know, it was the law, and she wanted to be one of the people upholding the law.
Thank you. We have a question here. RBG was an exceptional person in so many ways. I'm wondering, what are the most important life lessons you may have learned from her?
So I'm going to come back to family as one. Whenever I called her later on, often it was on some sort of business for Columbia Law School, but it wasn't always. Sometimes it was something else. And she would really always begin the conversation by asking about Meredith, asking about my kids. She would ask about them by name. She would remember, but she was sending a signal there. And the signal was that in addition to whatever ambitions we all have professionally, we really need to remember the importance of family. And for her, part of the point was, and David, you're a man, but you're an equal partner in raising children, and the world will be better if that's what you do. And I like to think I took that to heart. Certainly it's an important lesson that we should all aspire to follow. So that's one. A second is she would talk about, her phrase was, don't knock chess pieces off the table. And by that she meant, if somebody on the other side has a good argument, don't ignore it. Answer it, and answer it honestly. And the corollary to that was, you can say something that sounds really good, but remember how they're going to answer it. And if you've put it in a way that's sort of sharp, but leaves you open to a powerful response, then after the response, you will actually be worse off than if you'd said nothing. So as you make an argument, think about how others will respond to it, and then strengthen the argument and maybe limit the argument so that you make it properly. So family, sort of honesty and strategic arguments. And the third I'll mention is collegiality, just coming back to that again. She was determined to preserve cordial, polite relations with everyone. You know, if you didn't agree with her once, that's fine. You might agree with her next time. There was no upside to her and sort of venting and making herself feel good, but in a way that later someone would remember it, perhaps not want to agree with her just on personal grounds. And I think that takes discipline, because sometimes we just get angry, and she didn't do that. She had an incredible will about that sort of thing, and it was effective. So I would actually say, particularly in recent years, that's becoming a bit of a vanishing art. People are sort of eager to vent and maybe lose their tempers a bit, and certainly say what they really think of you personally when they disagree. And she would say it's a mistake, and I agree.
Wonderful life lessons from her, truly. We have a question here about whether or not your political difference in political views ever created any tension in your relationship at any point, either during the clerkship or afterwards. Doesn't sound like that was her style.
No. I mean, I certainly think we were close. My impression is that she would say that about us to other people. And she would say with a little bit of humor that, you know, she maybe didn't always agree with me, but that was fine. So it was certainly something she knew, something I knew, but no, I don't think, for me anyway, and for her it was 10. And you know, we'd have a conversation where, well, what did you think? And I'd say, oh, I didn't really agree. The truth is, Justice, and here's why. And she'd listen, but she was a very confident person. She didn't need to think that everyone always agreed with her, and she was just interested.
Would you classify her as more of an introvert or an extrovert?
I think she was more of a listener than a talker.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that over the years, she came to enjoy more and more being in a crowd. But I do think that when I was working for her, it was her second year on the court, I think she maybe had less enthusiasm for going and speaking in front of a large group than she would have later. And I remember I was on the board of the 92nd Street Y, and she was speaking there, and so they'd asked me to introduce her, and she was having a great time. But I'm not sure that she would have felt the same delight in that kind of opportunity some years earlier. So definitely an introvert, but less and less so over the years.
Without going into political ideology, if this is a comfortable question, what do you think RBG would have thought about Judge Amy Coney Barrett's qualifications as a future justice? There's a question in the chat about that.
Yeah, I don't really, I mean, what I will say, I'll say that RBG really appreciated having women on the court. There was a period in time after Justice O'Connor retired, when she was the only woman, she was quite vocal about thinking that that was a step in the wrong direction. So obviously Justice Barrett is a woman. Justice Barrett is a very, very smart and capable woman. I'm sure RBG would have admired that. But I can't speculate about how she would have felt. I don't know.
Of course. To what extent were your views fully formed before your clerkship, and how much were they informed by your experience working directly with RBG?
So I was lucky to have a really wonderful writing tutor. And one of the things that RBG would do her entire career, but as a clerk, you got to see it up close, is she would write and then rewrite and then rewrite again and then rewrite again. And I'm quite sure that that's not what I was doing before my clerkship, but I can tell you that ever since, it's what I've done. And so certainly in terms of the craft of lawyering, of thinking through how to make an argument, what to start with, why this particular word could be improved by swapping in that particular word. That kind of meticulous craftsmanship, it's something that she would teach to all of us, all her clerks, and I benefited enormously. I think in matters of judicial philosophy, we all evolve over time. I was grateful to get to understand her views over the years. They've never really been my views, weren't then, they aren't now. But I can't think of a more persuasive or eloquent defender of those views than RBG.
Switching gears for a moment, we have a question here. RBG had a very sophisticated sense of fashion. Are there any stories about her classy wardrobe, those signature collars that she wore?
So my sense from her is that the collar was something she experimented with because someone gave her a gift and she figured she'd try it. And she was sort of pleasantly surprised that it made such an impression. But once it did, she was getting these as gifts very regularly, and she then liked to rotate them in order to express her appreciation to the people who thought to make the gift. And some of them actually were quite symbolically appropriate for different occasions. So that I can tell you. I will also share one other memory, which is she was kind enough while I was at JDC to host a dinner for some people from JDC at the court. And one of the people who came was Stuart Weitzman, who has a very successful company. And it turns out that he had heard from one of the justice's friends that she really liked Stuart Weitzman's shoes, but she had mentioned in passing that there was one particular kind that they didn't make in red, and if only they did. So at the dinner, he pulled out a shopping bag and said, "I heard you wanted them in red." And so she laughed.
How wonderful. Given what you've said about her enjoying having other female justices on the court, how important she felt it was to have female representation on the court, what was her relationship like with Justices Kagan and Sotomayor?
I think quite close. And the caveat is I was obviously not clerking when they were there. So I know this really just from visiting her, from talking to her, but they were two very, very good friends. And she admired and really liked each of them. And I think she felt close to all of her colleagues on the court, but I also think she had a certain special feeling of closeness, a special bond to the other women.
What's the first word that comes to mind when you think of RBG?
Brilliantly smart. Just as smart as they come.
That has certainly come through this evening. Thank you. We have a question here about whether or not you were able to attend her memorial service at the Supreme Court.
So I actually was not. And the reason is that one of my kids had just had a COVID test. And fortunately, the test came back negative, and I was all geared up to go if only the test would come back in time. But we literally got the test result as I was watching it on TV. And the last thing that I wanted to do was to risk infecting anyone. If one of my kids was positive, perhaps maybe I would become positive. That was certainly not what I would do. But for that reason, I didn't get to go.
This is a little bit unrelated, but we have a few questions in the chat that want to know just a little bit about the work you did at the Joint Distribution Committee.
Sure. JDC is about 105 years old at this point. The missions are two. One is caring for vulnerable or needy Jewish people anywhere in the world. And the second is nurturing and strengthening Jewish communities around the world. And the budget there is $365 million a year. It's one of the biggest nonprofits around. And it was a great privilege to be involved in that work. I think part of what I helped to do was to try to sharpen the priorities a bit, to change the planning process, to figure out what the next 100 years would need. But it was really a wonderful experience for me, and certainly the organization does important and great work.
In the few minutes that we have left, I wanted you to discuss with us a little bit about her legacy, and also specifically, what would RBG have wanted her legacy to be?
So I think very high on that list would be the idea that we needed to live in a world where women and men considered child rearing to be a collective endeavor, and where people were judged on their abilities alone without regard to gender, background. And I really do think, certainly on that second point, she's one, right? I think you look at law school classes today, half of them are women. I don't think there's any sense that there are some positions that only male lawyers should have as opposed to female lawyers. And it really is difficult even to remember, and I say difficult for someone my age or younger to remember what she experienced. But just as a bit of a digression in answering your question, I'm reminded of a story she liked to tell about her first year at Harvard Law School. And the dean at the time was Erwin Griswold, who very distinguished and prominent person, and actually later he would be the Solicitor General. He would be on the other side of some of the cases that she would go argue. She thought very highly of his intellect, and they did have a bond. I think he was actually quoted as saying, when she was nominated to the DC Circuit, that she was the Thurgood Marshall of the women's movement, which is true, but nice of him to say it. So he would invite the women in the class, and I think at Harvard her year there were about a dozen, invite them to come to his living room. The way she put it is, we'd come to his living room, sit in a semicircle, and he'd go from one of us to the next and ask the following question. Why, my colleagues want to know, he'd say, why do you think that you should take a place at Harvard Law School that could have gone to a man? And so that was the environment that she was in. I actually said, Justice, I'm just curious, do you remember what question you asked, what answer you gave? And so she laughed and she said, and I'm pretty sure she was poking a bit of fun, but that Dean Griswold didn't know. She said, well, I'm here because I want to understand my husband's work. In any event, part of the legacy should be equal opportunities for women on the merits. Part of it should be sort of a more collaborative approach to child rearing. And I think she was sort of the view that progress had been made, but not nearly enough. But I think also part of it more generally is justice under law, a limited role for judges, but judges being as clear as they can possibly be about what the law says. And her catchphrase in chambers was about an opinion, get it right and keep it tight. And at the beginning of every opinion, and I invite all of you to take another look at one, she always started with what she called the headline paragraph. And basically that was intended for people who weren't lawyers. She kind of wanted the opinion to start with language that was accessible enough that you didn't have to be a lawyer to understand what the issue was and what the court was saying. And then the rest of it, of course, would develop it, but in a more sophisticated way that maybe was meant primarily for Court of Appeals judges and for lawyers to try to clarify what the law was. But again, that was a great passion of hers, was to knowing that the right opinions could give the kind of guidance that would make the legal system work better, and hopefully in a way that was going to affect, in all the right ways, the people that she was there to serve.
Incredible. I want to thank you so much, David, for being here this evening to share your reflections, your memories. We covered a lot of ground tonight, and I think our audience is very grateful and appreciative of it. So I want to thank everyone for attending this evening. It was wonderful to see so many people here, if not the faces, then the names in the chat. And we really appreciate not only your being here for our alums and parents, but you came to the middle school to speak to our students as well separately. and we're incredibly grateful to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you once again, David. It is really a privilege for us to have you in the Ramaz community. You've really graced your presence has been felt on many levels. We have privilege to have you as part of our executive board, and it's really a privilege to have your children and your family here. And equally, Jennifer, it continues to be such a privilege to have you as a colleague and friend. And thank you for agreeing to come on after a very long day. And we know that lots of good things to come. And I wish everyone here this evening a happy Thanksgiving, and remind you all that we continue to have our Zoom programming. We have the privilege of our remaster classes that we have advertised. Really have 3 outstanding Ramaz mastered educators: Jonathan Cannon, our head of school, Rabbi Shiowitz, who is a senior member of our faculty, and Dr. John Jacoby, all giving these absolutely outstanding remaster classes. Please sign up and join us for those. And of course, we'll continue our series of Zooms. Please join us for those as well. We wish everyone, again, a happy Thanksgiving, and thank you for joining us, and have a good night. Good night, everyone.
Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Good night.